The first time David saw the elephant, it was no larger than a horse and barely breathing. Mud caked its legs, its ears hung like wilted leaves, and one eye was swollen shut. He had been patrolling the outer edge of the reserve with nothing but a radio, a rifle he rarely used, and a headache from too many sleepless nights. The heat shimmered over the tall grass, and the horizon was smeared with distant smoke. Poachers had been seen nearby. At first, he thought the calf was dead. It didn't flinch when he approached. No groan, no shift of breath, just stillness. Then, as he knelt beside it, it moved. Not much, just a tremor through the flank. That was enough. He radioed for backup. It took 4 hours for help to arrive, and the entire time, David stayed by the calf's side. He poured his canteen over its trunk to cool it down, chased vultures away when they landed too close, and whispered to it like that might keep it tethered to the world. When the vet team finally came, the lead medic said, "It's a miracle she's still alive. The mother had likely been killed." There were signs nearby, boot prints, shell casings, flattened brush. The rest of the herd had fled, but this one, she had been too slow, too young. David stayed through the surgery, through the recovery, through the rehab, and slowly the calf came back. Stronger, louder. She followed him around the edge of the fence like a shadow, tripping over her own feet but always catching up. He called her Suri. He wasn't supposed to name her. Not really. Conservation guidelines discouraged attachment. But he wasn't good at following guidelines. He brought her bananas, played old blues music on a tinny portable speaker while sitting by her pen. She would press her trunk against the chain link whenever she saw him, chirping and rumbling until he laughed and told her to quiet down. And then, just like that, she was gone. Not dead, not lost, just released. Suri had recovered. She was healthy, strong, capable. The team moved her to a relocation zone 300 miles north, where she would join a herd in a protected migration corridor. David wasn't told until after it happened. He came to work one morning and her enclosure was empty.
No goodbye, no ceremony.
Just a note on the whiteboard. Suri moved.
6:30 Uhr morgens.
He stood there for a long time, hand on the chain link, the speaker still warm in his pack. And then he walked away. 20 years passed. David left the bush and moved back home. His knee gave out in his late 40s. Too many bad jumps, bad landings, bad weather. He bought a cabin near the forest in a part of the country where no one asked questions. Grew a beard. Got good at fixing radios. He didn't talk much. Didn't drink either. Just worked odd jobs, carved wood, read old field notes he'd saved. He kept a photo of Suri tucked into an empty frame on his bookshelf. Not hung, just there, in case he forgot her face. He figured she was long gone. Poachers, disease, natural predators. Elephants didn't always get a fair shot, even the lucky ones. But then came the storm. It hit in the middle of October, the kind of storm that peeled shingles off roofs and tossed trees like pencils. David rode it out in his basement, flashlight gripped tight, radio buzzing with static. When it passed, the road was blocked, power lines down. He walked the property in the morning, checking damage, clearing what he could. That's when he saw the tracks. Big, too big, not bear, not moose. They cut through the back of his property, pressed deep into the soaked earth. David stopped breathing. The prints were round, white. He knelt beside one and placed his hand flat in the center. It didn't even reach the edges. He stood up slowly, turned toward the trees, and deep in the pines, something moved. David didn't move. For a few seconds, the forest ahead of him was silent except for the soft dripping of rain from the leaves, the occasional rustle of wind pulling through pine branches, and the slow, deliberate cracking of twigs far ahead, too heavy to be deer, too measured to be chance. He squinted into the shadows between the trees, his heartbeat dull and thick in his ears. And then, for just a moment, he saw her, a silhouette, towering, still, barely visible between the trunks, framed in mist and sunlight slicing through a gap in the clouds. An elephant, not a wild hallucination, not a shape mistaken in the fog. This was real. Her tusks were uneven, one longer than the other, and her left ear was torn in a way that triggered something deep in his memory. He stepped forward, mouth dry. She didn't run. She didn't charge. She simply looked at him, and in that gaze, David felt the years collapse. The jungle, the rehab pen, the blues music crackling from his speaker. All of it came rushing back in a single breath. He whispered her name, half afraid it would break the spell. Suri. The elephant blinked. Then, with an almost imperceptible sway of her head, she stepped back into the trees and vanished. David didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window with a flashlight, watching the edge of the forest, unsure if what he saw had truly been real or just something conjured by loneliness and memory. But the tracks remained. And the next morning, near the edge of the property, he found something he couldn't explain. Bananas. 3 of them, slightly bruised, laid in a neat row near the split rail fence. He hadn't bought bananas in months, no neighbors for miles, and bears didn't stack fruit. He picked them up, heart thudding, and turned toward the forest. Suri, he whispered again, like calling to an old friend. That afternoon, he took out the old speaker from the back of the closet. It barely worked, dusted, rusted, full of static. But when he hit the play button, it let out a crackling blues tune that filled the cabin like an echo of another lifetime. He set the speaker on the back porch, facing the trees, and let it play. An hour passed, then 2. Nothing moved. The sun began to dip behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the clearing. David poured himself a cup of tea, hands shaking just enough to spill a drop on the wood. When he heard it, the low, rolling rumble of something massive breathing nearby. He stepped outside. She was there, closer now, not just a silhouette. Her eyes caught the light and reflected it with a softness that made his chest ache. The same left ear torn, the same scar along her right shoulder. It was her. She let out a low, breathy huff and took a single step forward. David didn't move. The memory of rules flashed through his head. Do not approach. Do not make sudden movements. Do not assume recognition. But he ignored all of them. I thought you were dead, he said, voice low, breaking. I thought they'd taken you and I'd never see you again. Suri moved slowly, her trunk extending toward the porch, sweeping gently through the air like she was trying to remember the scent of something half-forgotten. She stopped just shy of the bottom step. Then she lowered herself to one knee. David had seen elephants do this before, when resting, when in pain, when mourning. But this wasn't any of those. This felt deliberate, respectful, like a greeting. David sank to the step, his hands braced on his knees, staring at the animal he'd once called family. He didn't need to speak anymore. She was here. That was enough. By morning, she was gone again. The forest returned to stillness. No tracks, no sound. But the bananas kept coming every few days, always left in the same place. And sometimes new ones. Mangoes, a cluster of leaves bundled around roots. It was like a ritual, a silent exchange, and David responded in kind. He left water in a ceramic basin, slices of sweet fruit, and each night he played music, the old songs she might remember. As the days passed, he noticed something else. The forest had grown quieter, but not in a dead way, more like reverence. Fewer deer passed through. Birds sat in stillness longer. Even the wind moved differently, like the woods themselves were listening. Then came the men. David spotted them just after noon. 3 of them, dressed in tactical khakis and boots too clean for the area. One carried a camera with a lens the size of a coffee can. Another had a rifle, though not drawn. The third had binoculars and an expression that told David everything he needed to know. He walked out to meet them, hands visible, calm but firm. You're not from around here. The man with the binoculars nodded. Just following a lead. On what? David asked, though he already knew. There was a sighting, the man said. Large female, not tagged, unaccounted for. She's not yours, David said. The man smiled politely. If she's untagged, she's unprotected. Could be dangerous. She's not. They never are, the man said. Until they are. David didn't let them onto the property. He walked the perimeter that night, checking the fence, inspecting the trails. He knew what they were after. Not a rescue, not conservation. They wanted a trophy, or a claim, or proof that some ghost of the past still walked. He wouldn't let them take her again. That night, he left a message in the clearing. Not words, just a carving on a flat piece of wood, placed where he knew she'd find it. A spiral, the sign they used back on the reserve to mean go, danger, hide. The same one rangers would leave for each other when patrols went wrong. 2 days passed. No tracks.
No bananas. No Suri.
He told himself it was for the best. But the silence felt unbearable. Until the 6th day, just before dawn, he opened the door and found something new on the porch. Not fruit, not gifts. A single, delicate object. A charm. A handmade loop of twine threaded with 3 small wooden beads and 1 large one in the center, painted blue. He knew it. Years ago, he had made a necklace just like it for Suri's keeper on her last day at the reserve. Something to remember her by. He hadn't seen it since. And now it was here. David's breath caught. She had been closer than he thought. She was watching. And maybe she wasn't alone. David stared at the charm for a long time before picking it up. The twine was worn but intact. The paint on the large blue bead chipped at the edges. He turned it over in his hands slowly, like it might vanish if he blinked. The last time he'd seen that necklace, it had been tied around the wrist of Kieran, the young intern who had helped nurse Suri back to health. She'd been just 18 then, full of fire and defiance, always humming while she worked, always talking to the animals like they were old friends. David had carved those beads himself, one for each of the calves' surviving days during her recovery, and the blue one in the center for future days. The one Suri hadn't lived through yet. It had been a private moment, almost ceremonial, a gesture of gratitude between 2 people who both knew what it meant to watch something cling to life when it had every reason to let go. And now, years and continents later, it had shown up on his porch. The implications chilled him. Suri hadn't just found him. She had carried something with her, or someone had returned it to her. That meant memory, purpose, travel, something far more intelligent than random wandering. It meant someone else remembered. David walked the perimeter of his land twice that day, slower than usual, looking for tracks, signs, disturbances. Nothing obvious, no broken branches, no large prints. It had rained the day before, and any markings had been washed away. Still, he felt watched. Not in a fearful way, not like prey being stalked. More like standing in a room where someone had just left. The warmth lingered. The silence had shape. That night, he didn't play music. Instead, he turned off the porch light and sat in complete darkness. The old speaker in his lap, the charm in his hand. The wind moved through the trees gently, but nothing else stirred. He stayed up until dawn, and when he stepped outside the next morning, another object had appeared. This time, a strip of cloth, red and dusty, frayed at the edges. Took him a few minutes to place it. It was from the old ranger uniforms, the ones issued during his last year in the field. It had been part of his own sleeve. He had torn it during the flood rescue, wrapped it around Suri's ankle when she got tangled in barbed wire near the river crossing. It hadn't been clean, but it had worked. He hadn't seen that cloth in over 2 decades. She had kept it, and now she was sending him pieces of the past, tokens, memories, warnings. He realized it wasn't just communication. It was a trail. David packed a small bag, strapped on his boots, and headed into the forest before noon. He didn't follow a specific direction. He followed instinct. The slight bends in the trees, the spots where the moss had been crushed slightly, the breaks in the low brush. He moved slow, steady, careful. For hours he saw nothing. Then, near dusk, he found it. A grove, circular, quiet, ringed with stones and old, charred stumps. Not natural, not accidental. There had been fire here once, maybe years ago, maybe decades. In the center lay a pile of objects. Twigs, bones, feathers, bark carved with lines and shapes. Offerings, maybe, or warnings. And among them, unmistakably, lay another handmade necklace, newer, brighter with 5 beads, all gold-painted. One for each of the men who had come looking. David crouched beside the pile. The message was clear. She had seen them, and she had remembered what men with guns did to her kind. The gold wasn't decoration. It was a threat, or a vow. David stood slowly. That night, he returned to the cabin, drew the blinds, and locked every door. The next day, he called an old friend. Rajiv Patel hadn't spoken to David in 12 years. But when he picked up, he knew immediately who it was. "I thought you were dead," Rajiv said without bitterness. "Not yet," David replied. "But something's alive that shouldn't be." Rajiv didn't need convincing. A tracker for over 30 years, he'd seen his share of ghost stories with tusks. David sent him a photo of the charm. Then the cloth. Within an hour, Rajiv had booked a flight. They met at the edge of the old trail 3 days later, armed with nothing but binoculars, cameras, and 2 decades of shared regret. Rajiv whistled low when he saw the grove. "This is no accident," he said. "She's mapping." David nodded. "I think she's been watching them longer than they've been watching her." "And us?" Rajiv asked. "Why come back now?" David looked down at the beads. "Maybe she's not just remembering. Maybe she's asking for help." They set up a blind that night, a small camouflaged shelter with infrared cameras, bait-free observation, low light, no sound. David knew Suri would notice it immediately, but that was the point. He wanted her to know they weren't hiding, that this was permission, not surveillance. The forest was still again. And then movement. Just after midnight, the camera blinked. A shape, massive, slow, deliberate. She entered the frame like fog, not crashing through but melting into the edge of visibility. Her trunk extended toward the camera. She didn't destroy it. She didn't even touch it. She just looked directly into the lens and stood there. For minutes. Then she turned and walked away. But not alone. A smaller shape followed behind her. David's heart stopped. It wasn't another adult. It was a calf. Tiny, unsteady, and unmistakably hers. David replayed the footage until the battery died. Each time, the moment landed the same way, like a weight behind his ribs. The calf was real. Small, barely past weaning. Its movements clumsy but full of that newborn instinct for survival. It stayed close to Suri, nearly beneath her belly at times, only venturing a few steps ahead before retreating at the first snap of a twig. Suri never rushed it. She moved like a guardian, her massive frame always between the calf and the world beyond. She hadn't just come back to remember, she had come to protect. Rajiv watched the video beside him in silence. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair and stared out the window toward the trees. "She had a calf," he said softly. "She brought it here because she knew something was coming," David replied. "And now we know what she's afraid of." Rajiv nodded grimly. The men, the trackers, they weren't just here for her. They were here to intercept. A calf that young is worth a fortune to the wrong people. David didn't answer. He was already pulling the maps from the table drawer, spreading them out. "They'll be back," he said. "She didn't bring him here to stay forever. She brought him here so I'd know, so I could help." They planned in the dark. Rajiv had brought equipment, motion sensors, radio mics, a spare camera drone. David still had the land, the knowledge of how the terrain twisted, where the trees broke just enough for escape, where old logging paths dipped beneath the ridge. He marked the places where the calf would be safest, where Suri would feel least cornered. They couldn't force her into a sanctuary. That would take weeks of permits, sedatives, cages, transport, and it would destroy the bond. They had only one option: create a safe zone and hold it. The following morning, they began. It was slow, precise work, laying lines of biodegradable scent markers laced with calming agents, installing low-frequency noise emitters that deterred predators, mapping a grid of movement-triggered alarms that would silently alert them to intruders. They weren't building a trap. They were building a buffer, a bubble of silence and safety in a forest that was no longer neutral. David saw signs of them again 2 days later, boot prints fresh, near the riverbed. Candy wrapper, footprint in the mud, the sole patterned with tactical rubber. He and Rajiv covered the trail quickly, then doubled their shifts. That night she came again. Suri didn't enter the clearing. She stopped just short of the motion sensor perimeter and waited. The calf hovered behind her legs, ears twitching. David didn't approach. He stood at the cabin's edge, arms loose at his sides, and bowed his head slightly. "You're safe," he said. "I see you. I'll watch." She chuffed low acknowledgement, then turned and vanished once more. By the end of the week, everything had changed. The press had picked up rumors. "Wild elephant sighting in Pacific Northwest," read one headline. "Legendary ranger protecting rogue herd?" asked another. How the stories leaked, David didn't know. Maybe the men watching had shared too much. Maybe someone at the sanctuary had guessed and said the wrong thing. Either way, attention was now a risk. He and Rajiv shut off the satellite feed, closed every connection to outside tech, and removed the cameras. What mattered now wasn't evidence. It was defense. Then came the drone. Not theirs. Fast. Silent. Painted matte black. It buzzed through the upper canopy one morning, slicing the quiet into shreds, and Suri didn't wait to see what it wanted. She vanished so deep into the woods that even David couldn't track her. For 3 days, she didn't return. Then, in the middle of the fourth night, the alarm tripped. Motion. East Ridge. 2 figures. David and Rajiv moved quickly, silently, rifles slung but untouched. They reached the ridge and crouched in the underbrush, watching. The men had flashlights, but they weren't clumsy. They moved like professionals. One of them knelt near a pile of dung and nodded to the other. They were close. Too close. David made a decision. He stepped out. "Back off," he said, voice sharp. "Now." The men froze. One raised his hands slightly. "Just looking. Not breaking any laws." "You're tracking a mother and a calf," David growled. "You come near them again, I won't wait for the law." The second man spoke, voice calm. "They're not yours, Ranger." "No," David said. "They're not yours either." For a moment, no one moved. Then the man smiled, mock pleasant. "Be careful, old man. Things get dangerous out here at night." David didn't flinch. "I know." They left. Slowly. Too slowly. But they didn't come back that night. When David returned to the cabin, there was something on the porch again. This time it wasn't fruit. It was a footprint, pressed in mud. Small, round, the calves. He had come to the cabin. He had stood there, waiting. David sat down on the step and felt something rise in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not awe, responsibility. He couldn't protect them forever, but he could do one more thing. He could disappear with them. He looked at Rajiv the next morning and said only 2 words. "We move." They didn't announce their departure. There were no calls made, no permits filed, no digital traces left behind. Rajiv wiped the drives, burned the maps, and disabled the trail sensors. David packed light. A heavy-duty pack with 3 days of food, a knife, extra water filters, and the old speaker, still functional, though barely. He placed it carefully in a padded pouch. Not because they'd use it, but because it mattered. Suri's memory had brought her back. The least he could do was honor the sound that once kept her alive. The plan wasn't complicated. Head north, through the lowlands and river trails, into the overgrown wildlife corridor that hadn't seen commercial traffic in over 20 years. The area was officially labeled as non-viable land after a wildfire gutted most of its development plans. Unpatrolled, untouched, and, more importantly, unreachable without knowing the exact entry points, which David did. He had helped map it when it was still federal land. They moved before dawn. Suri met them at the western tree line, silent and ready. The calf, smaller than David remembered, all knees and blinking eyes, stuck close to her legs, wobbling slightly with each step. David crouched, palms down, letting the calf get a look at him. "You don't know me yet," he murmured. "But your mother does." Suri let out a low breath. The calf mimicked it, then turned and leaned against her side. The message was clear. They would follow. For now. Rajiv led. David stayed behind, watching the rear. Every few miles, they stopped to listen. They weren't alone. Somewhere in the trees, others were moving too. Not Suri's kind. The other kind. Men. They didn't need to be seen to be felt. The way birds stopped singing. The way squirrels froze on branches. The way the air held its breath. The first day passed quietly. They made 15 kilometers. Camped in a small clearing beneath a rock ledge where the wind couldn't reach them. Rajiv set up no fire. Just dry food, a sleeping mat, and the old ranger's habit of sleeping in boots. Suri stood at the edge of the trees, her eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. She didn't sleep. Neither did David. The second day, the rain came. Not heavy, but enough to make every step louder than it should be. Mud clung to the calves' legs. David had to slow the pace. Suri adjusted for him, circling slightly to the flank and letting her body shield her child from the wind. David watched the way she moved, not instinctually, but intelligently, strategically, as if she had learned not just how to survive, but how to lead. That night, they heard the drone. Faint at first, then sharper. A quiet hum slicing across the sky like a whisper of threat. Rajiv threw a camo tarp over the calf. David pulled Suri beneath an overhang. They didn't move. The drone passed once, then again, then silence. But the damage was done. They'd been found. Tomorrow we cut west, David said. No more trails. Rajiv frowned. Too steep, and we lose the river. We lose the chase, David answered. Suri chuffed once, almost like agreement. The next morning, they broke from the mapped path, straight into overgrown terrain, thick vines, thorns, rocks slick with moss and memory. The going was brutal. The calf fell twice. David had to guide it around fallen trunks. His legs screamed. His back threatened rebellion. But they kept moving. And then, just before sundown, they saw it. A fence. Not barbed. Not metal. Stone. Old, worn down, half swallowed by roots and earth. The remnants of a forgotten outpost once used by researchers, then abandoned. Beyond it, a valley dipped into mist. Trees taller than buildings. No roads. No signal. No way in except the way they came. David stepped through first. The calf followed. Suri paused at the threshold, then rumbled deep in her chest and entered. They set camp by a pond, fresh water and untouched. No footprints. No signs. Finally, safety. David watched Suri lower her trunk into the water and drink deeply. The calf splashed beside her, letting out a shrill trumpet that startled the frogs into silence. For a moment it looked like joy, but then a sound cracked through the trees. Gunshot. Rajiv was up in seconds, rifle drawn. North Ridge, he said. Not far. David didn't hesitate. He reached for the speaker in his bag and switched it on. Not loud, just one song. A soft, familiar blues melody, worn and scratchy. The one he used to play for her when she was sick. He placed it on the ground near the trail and turned to Suri. Go, he said. Suri blinked. David pointed west. Take him and go. Rajiv was already moving, packing, scanning the ridges. Another shot. Closer. Suri hesitated. Then she stepped forward and gently touched her trunk to David's chest. Just once and turned. The calf followed. They vanished into the trees. David picked up his rifle, turned toward the north ridge, and waited. He didn't need to outrun the danger. He just needed to buy them time. David crouched low behind the thick roots of an ancient pine, eyes scanning the north ridge through the scope of his rifle. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. The gun was old, its barrel worn, but he had cleaned it that morning like it might matter. The music still played softly behind him, curling through the trees like a ghost from another time. The same tune Suri had heard 20 years ago in a dusty rehab pen as she clung to life. Now it filled the valley, a kind of farewell or perhaps a warning. Another shot rang out, not aimed, not close, but deliberate. A signal. They were pushing closer, trying to spook movement. Drive their targets toward open ground. These weren't amateurs. They were trained, patient, the kind of men who knew how to take something alive, or destroy it clean. David waited. He knew this land better than anyone. The wind patterns, the ridgelines, the spots where sound carried and where it died. And he knew something else too. Suri would not run far. not without knowing he was safe. The calf would follow her, but she would loop back, because that's what she did, what she always did, protect. A twig snapped 20 yards ahead, then another, voices low and clipped, English but not local. North Bend, confirmed Prince. David took a breath and stepped into view. Looking for something? He called, rifle low but visible. The two men turned sharply, startled by his sudden appearance. One raised a hand. Sir, this is protected land. No, it isn't, David interrupted. It was decommissioned 15 years ago. Now it's forgotten land. You're trespassing. The second man, taller, dark-bearded, didn't answer. His eyes narrowed. We're wildlife response. No, you're not, David said. You're poachers with a license to lie. Silence. Then, slowly, the second man lowered his hand to the side of his belt. Not to a gun, but to a flare. David raised his rifle a little higher. Don't. I don't want trouble, the man said. You already found it, David replied. And then, something unexpected. A deep, low vibration beneath his feet. Faint, rhythmic, heavy. The second man's head snapped around. What is that? David didn't answer. He didn't need to. Suri appeared from the tree line like thunder in motion. Silent, massive, unstoppable. Not charging, not reckless, just walking, with the force of memory and rage coiled in her steps. Her ears were wide, her eyes locked on the intruders. Behind her, the calf trailed at a distance, confused but alert. One of the men dropped the flare. The other stepped back. Suri stopped between David and the poachers, her trunk curling slightly in the air, tasting their scent, remembering. Call them off, the bearded man hissed. She's not mine to call, David said. The men backed up, then turned, and ran. David didn't stop them. Let them carry their fear back with them. Let them tell the story. Suri turned to him, eyes searching. David lowered his rifle. He's safe, he said. You got him through. She blinked once, then did something she hadn't done since she was a calf. She knelt, right there in the forest, in front of the man who once pulled thorns from her feet and played scratchy songs under desert stars. She lowered her body in trust and peace, and stayed that way for nearly 10 minutes. They didn't go back to the cabin. They didn't need to. Rajiv had already packed what mattered and burned what didn't. There were no more trails, no more maps. Just wilderness. Freedom. For the next 2 days, David and Rajiv moved with them, not leading but following. The calf had grown stronger with each step, more curious, more confident. Suri let him wander a few steps ahead now, but never far. When the mist rose in the morning, she lifted her trunk to test the wind. When the moonlight came through the canopy, she hummed low and soft, like singing to the earth itself. They reached the northern glade on the third day. It was a place David remembered only from rumors. A hidden basin, rimmed with rock and old cedar trees, unreachable by road, unmarked by satellite. And somehow Suri knew it too. She walked into the center, turned once in a full circle and stilled. This was it. This was where they would stay. That evening, Rajiv built a small fire. Not for warmth, for goodbye. David sat across from him, holding the old speaker in his lap. He turned it on. The same song played, crackling softly through the dark. Suri didn't approach, but she stood close enough for it to reach her. The calf lay beside her now, curled against her massive side. Safe. Finally, truly safe. David placed the speaker on a flat stone, stood, and walked away. The speaker played long after they were gone. The old blues tune crackled through the clearing, its sound softened by leaves, bent grass, and time. Suri didn't move. She stood like a statue, her head tilted slightly toward the sound. The calf shifted once in its sleep, letting out a small trumpet that barely broke the stillness. When the song ended, there was silence again. Not empty, full of every footstep that had led here, every mile, every year, every promise. David didn't look back until the hill crested behind them. From the ridge, the glade below looked almost like a painting, green and gold and still. He felt the weight of it pressing against his ribs. Not sorrow, not joy, just something deeper. That rare ache of having done something right and knowing it wouldn't last forever, because nothing ever does, but it was enough. Rajiv broke the silence beside him. "We'll mark the path," he said, "in case they ever want to return." David nodded. They didn't talk much after that. Some goodbyes are made with silence. They left the valley before sunrise, their footprints washing away with the morning dew. By noon, they were ghosts in the trees. By evening, they were off the map entirely. Back at the cabin, David found the place too small, too quiet, but he didn't touch anything. He left the photos on the shelf. The speaker, long silent now, went on the windowsill facing the woods. The charm Suri had returned, the blue bead in the center, he wore around his neck. Months passed. Then a letter arrived. No name on the envelope. Inside was a photo, an aerial shot of the glade. Suri standing tall, the calf now larger by her side. And something else. Behind them, barely visible, was a third shape. Another elephant. Younger, stronger. Another orphan, maybe, or maybe not. David stared at it for a long time. He turned the photo over. On the back, written in a language older than ink, was a single word. Found. He built a bench that spring. Simple, wooden, faced the forest. He sat there often, sometimes reading, sometimes not, sometimes watching the edge of the trees like something might move. It never did. Not again. But once, just before dusk, he swore he heard the sound of heavy feet moving through leaves. A breath that wasn't his. And somewhere, deep in the trees, a low rumble. So quiet it could have been thunder. Or memory. Or both. He smiled, stood, and whispered into the wind, "Thank you."